It's tabletop time! And I'm Dave. Today, I'm bringing you something a little bit different. I've actually been working on this personal project for a few months, and this started back when I decided to dive into the Lumineth Realm Lord's army. I really was waiting for High Elves in Age of Sigmar for the longest time, and the Lumineth seems like the closest thing we're going to get. So I dived on it, and I saw this Cenari Cathalar, and the way that Games Workshop have painted their model has this like sheer veil on. In fact, it's sculpted. You pretty much can't avoid painting a sheer veil. You grab this model, you're painting a sheer veil. I just really wanted to push myself and try something new, and I really hope you like it. I really did, and I had a lot of fun painting it. Now, you'll be able to see from the footage that I actually made a really controversial decision in painting this. A lot of my fans are going to be complaining about this, but I decided it's the personal direction I wanted to take, which is that I've actually decided not to include my thumb in 75% of the footage of this video. As a left-handed person, I made the controversial leap to actually filming with a camera over my right shoulder. People have enjoyed my avant-garde take on making miniature painting videos, mostly around the concept of my thumb. So for this one though, I just hope you'll stick with me and watch the actual painting process. Check it out, let's dive in. So I assembled the core of the body, but I left off some key components that would make painting the sheer dress in particular extra difficult. So that's the sort of cauldron of souls that she's holding, her ponytail and her headdress were just going to get in the way, so I kept those off the model. I had also been hunting for a long time for the Fantasy Pro Fairy Flesh set, and I finally got my hands on that particular set, and I was keen to dive into painting a whole different kind of high fantasy concept flesh tone for this model. It's an elf, and I wanted it to feel a bit fantastical and with a very like strong popping sense of very vibrant colors. With these paints as my sort of limitation for the flesh, I began base coating with the reddish flesh. I covered all the areas that were very clearly skin that would be visible through the sheer dress with a little bit of bleed over. And this is important for when you're doing those kinds of effects, because that bleed over allows you to create a gradient and shows where the fabric is pulling away from the skin. It's semi-transparent, so you can still sort of see through that. It's only when the sheer fabric folds over itself or you're looking through multiple layers that it becomes very difficult to see what's underneath. Using the medium flesh, I made a gradient on my wet palette with the reddish flesh, working from one into the other. And I began the process of highlighting, slowly mixing very thin blends of these paints together and building up to the areas where I felt the light, which my source was a sun directly above. With the highlighting done, I then turned around and focused on the shading. One of the areas I'm trying to learn and trying to look into is an area that traditional painters are very good at, which is the basic principles of painting in terms of lighting, color theory, the way that light plays off real objects, but also the way that real objects and real people are actually colored. And when looking at a lot of references, it became very clear to me that people just aren't colored the way we're sort of trained to think they are. When you actually stop and look, human skin has so many different tones in it. We've got like purples and reds for where the veins can be seen under the skin. There's sort of yellow tones and green tones. And I tried to sort of start learning. I definitely don't think that this is intended to be like super hyper realistic skin. I mean, I launched out with the Fantasy Fairy Flesh set, trying to make a super like saturated, vibrant looking fantasy skin tone, but I still wanted to add a little bit. So with the shadows, I put in some greens and I used colors that I wouldn't usually use. But once I'd done this and I'd put down that core skin tone, it became time to do, well, the purpose of this video. It was time to paint the sheer dress effect. The secret here is it's a lot easier than you think. It's basically glazing. So I picked the color of the dress, which was going to be a Corax white color, and you just mix, I used my wet palette to mix out a glaze using glaze medium and the Corax white, and just blended it through and did progressive, very slow, very delicate, thin build up, multiple layers, concentrating on making a really smooth transition between the skin color and the dress. And with that blend, it gets that effect of the fabric moving away from the skin and it becoming harder to see through. To really sell that, I had to get lines of a stronger, non-glazed out version of the paint to paint on where the fabric would be pulling, where it would be overlapping, folding over itself, to create these creases and artificial lines that make you believe, or at least attempt to make you believe, the illusion that it is in fact fabric over skin as opposed to just like painted fabric. fabric that looks like skin. To continue selling this effect, I needed to start putting shadows into the actual dress itself. I stuck to very subtle colors, and again, it was just a process of thin, delicate glazing to build up to a stronger shade. One of the differences on this model is with this shading of the dress especially, I really tried to think about where the sun was coming from above, and the shading isn't necessarily in the deepest creases. Like, the deepest crease doesn't mean the deepest shade. It was all based on, well, where is the fold blocking the light from above? And I tried to shade it like that. Just another little way I'm trying to get better at painting is to try and focus on how light actually works. And that's an area I'm definitely a beginner in. The dress has a sort of a thick trim that covers the hem all around. And I was really thankful for this because that sort of embroidered lace thick trim really helps to sell it as fabric, because it's something we've probably seen a lot. We understand that those multi-layered fabrics become a lot more thick and the opacity changes so that the color is more defined. So by having that detail on the dress, it made it really easy to then paint that in just a solid color of white scar, just the brightest I could get it, to make it pop out and really look like, yes, a sewn in maybe silk trim on this sheer dress. It was at this point that our patrons came to the rescue, in the sense that they kept me company. I ran a couple of streams just on the Tabletop Time mini patron Discord while I was painting this, chatting and hanging out and getting some subtle cues and advice from what the patrons thought would be sort of good ways to take the model. And it was a lot of fun to paint that. So with them helping me out and just chatting idly while we worked, I threw down some brown tone for the hair. I want it to be blonde hair in the end. I'm thinking at this stage that it's going to be sort of a blonde haired elf. And to do that, to get a good blonde sense, I needed a light brown to lay down at the top. And I began with the non-metallic metal. I decided to do the headdress and the metallic details in non-metallic metal from the very beginning. It's a technique I'm fairly new to and trying to get better at. And this was my first attempt at creating my own non-metallic metal recipe. So previously I'd followed guides for silver and gold non-metallic metal from various websites, YouTube tutorials that have been really helpful. But this time I went, you know what, I think I've got an idea of the principles behind this, so I'm going to make my own blend. So I went for a more sort of a green hued gold. It's a subtle green hue, it's not that strong, but the effect is to attempt to make it look a lot more antique and a little bit more fantasy maybe than just the bright gold that you might associate with Stormcast Eternals in the setting. And using the classic high contrast look of dark shades with big popping highlights using bone colors, I finished up the non-metallic metal on the components that had been assembled. And as well up the top, there was the laurel wreath that is on her head. Given my scheme, I wanted to go with a vibrant green, a pop of green that would really pull the eyes to the face of the Cathalar and make you look. The vibrant green, I think, is just representative of like life. She is meant to be kind of the conduit between emotion and death, but I think it should be a mix. There's purples that will come into play later, and greens, and all these colors that kind of mix, and it's the yin and yang of dark and light at play within the emotions of the Cathalar herself. So that is where we ended the month or 6-week long journey of sitting at home and casually painting. It was time to take the model into the studio and finish it in one big hurrah. So with the Cathalar in the studio, the priority was to work on all the pieces that weren't attached to the model already. That was the basin of gems, as well as her ponytail on the top of the crest. And to finish it, I'd also need to base. The first step, and the main thing I was worried about, was actually emulating the non-metallic metal gold technique, because I hadn't touched it in about a month. In my foresight, I of course hadn't written down the recipe for the non-metallic metal, but I'm pretty sure I emulated it well. I dived in and worked heavily on the crest with a lot of highlights and contrast points. Jazza and I had a brief discussion as to whether or not I had time to paint the interior of the crest, and we both agreed, given that this was sort of a passion project, we needed to take the time to make it pretty much as good as we could. In hindsight, when you see it finished, I'm so glad I did, because it would have looked a lot worse with the whole thing just being non-metallic metal gold. With all the details, there's a bunch of tassels, there's a few crests, there's a crest on the center of her weird hoop belly thingy. I don't know what you call that, but there's a crest on it. They're all purple. I painted them purple. Purple is the color, the tertiary color of my army. I paint the Korax white with gold and purple as the color of their robes. So it was definitely the color that had to be for all the tassels, etc. I went with some green for the gems that hang from her headdress, which would tie in nicely with the green leaf laurels that rest upon her head. Now, the hair. It was supposed to be blonde, but when I tried to paint it, it just didn't work. It didn't sit at all right with the non-metallic metal. It just blended together. So I bit the bullet and said I need to change this. But I thought red, it felt too obvious, but I thought it would look good. So I went with redhead. So to do that, I would need to make a glaze. I was actually going to glaze over the blonde head. To make a good glaze using multiple colors and some glaze medium, I needed to use my wet palette. Thankfully, now that I was at the studio, I had access to a prototype of the brand new Everlasting Wet Palette 2. I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, Red Grass Games, and their amazing new wet palette, the Everlasting Wet Palette 2. Personally, I actually got given the original Everlasting Wet Palette as a birthday present, and I can tell you, it is probably the best single painting tool I've ever received. But the new Everlasting Wet Palette promises to be even better. They've got a brand new improved sealing system, which can really help keep the water and the paint in your wet palette, making sure that the consistency of your paint stays the way that you want to have it for as long as possible. They've also got a brand new hydration membrane, which is exclusive to Red Grass Games. You can actually reuse it. So you can reuse it at least 3 times.
You had one job. Just the one.
Gone are the days of chucking everyone out and just replacing them. You can wash it in the sink, which is just crazy to me, but it's amazing and it works. Get out of here. What? If you like those massive painting projects, they also have an XL version of the wet palette too. It's the same size as the old XL design, except it has all the improvements that the new design has. They've also got a new system for slide locking paint pot holder onto the wet palette, in addition to their usual, the shallow pot paint palette, which is really good for anytime you're needing to use like paints that you don't want to thin out, maybe sit at our washers, for example. They can just sit alongside your palette nicely and neatly and be far more protected from falling over. The Red Grass Games wet palette is actually currently still up on its Kickstarter. So there's a few days left. It's entering its final days. Make sure you check out the Kickstarter, dive in and back it, and you can get early access to one of their brand new wet palettes. Check it out on Kickstarter, and thank you again for sponsoring the video. With the glaze applied, there are a few highlights that I needed to put on the hair just to make it pop. Then it was time to glue on the ponytail. I may admit I was very scared I was going to break it, but we got it on in the end, although there's a little bit that's a bit bendy and fragile. Let's not talk about it. So that was close to done. I just had 2 major areas left. We had the smoke effect that's coming off the top of that basin full of feather quartz gems. Now, the smoke was a really good example of how you can use the right paints for the right method. On this, which I would consider a showcase model, I used contrast paints. Yes, that's right. I made a quick blend with 3 contrast paints to get that gradient on the smoke. And I think it worked really well. With the dry brush on top to highlight it up a bit, it looks awesome in my opinion. So there's plenty of space to use sort of tools that you might otherwise not consider using to achieve certain effects on models. And so we got towards the end of the model where it was time to put on that basing. I went with a Haitian feeling, which was just sort of some nice summer grasses, yellows, and just weathered up the base with a little bit of splash mud effects, and tried to keep it toned down so the focus of the model would be on the model. Well, there you have it. There she is. I am stoked. I'm really happy with this. I think this is one of those models that marks like a benchmark of progressing your painting technique. I'm just super happy with it. And I'm really glad to be able to share with you a paint job that's taken a bit more time and been a bit more personal. I really hope we can get to do more like this in the future. I want to say one more thank you to Red Grass Games for sponsoring the video, and please check out the Kickstarter. Go and get yourself one of the amazing new Everlasting Wet Palette 2s. So if you like this video and you want to see more of these high intensity paint jobs, chuck us a comment on what you'd like to see. If you want to see more of my Lumineth Realm Lords army, let me know. I'd certainly be happy to paint them at the studio. It's an excuse to get them done after all. So yeah, chuck in and comment a like if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe if you want to see more of this stuff. Thank you, as always, to our amazing Patreons who are going to be... There's no competition. they can just go there. They don't have to go over anyone else. Also, I just realized something. I think this is the first video at all that has just me in it. It's very lonely here. But that means no one's around to watch me do this. Yeah! Oh god.